guys, how's it going? For today's video, I am going to be trying something new. As you can probably guess, I read a lot, and I usually prefer to read physical books, mostly because I own so many physical books that I haven't read yet. I also really love ebooks. I have an e-reader. That's actually how I read most of the Wheel of Time series. I really like e-readers for really long books because it's easier just to hold up my little e-reader than to hold up a big, heavy book for long periods at a time. One thing I never do, though, is listen to audiobooks. Now, I want to say first, I have nothing at all against audiobooks. I think they're great for people that like them and for people that can use them. I think they're a completely valid way to read. No shame at all on audiobooks. But I just personally have a really hard time paying attention to sounds. I'm a very visual person and I get distracted easily. But I have to admit, audiobooks are really convenient. And I've definitely noticed them getting a lot more popular lately. And I don't know, I just felt like I was missing out. So I decided I'm going to give it a very solid try. I don't know. If I want to say that I don't listen to audiobooks, I want to be able to also say that I really tried. So I bought a couple audiobooks and I am going to try them out. I decided for this experiment to pick out 3 audiobooks. I wanted to pick one that I specifically heard good things about the audiobook format itself. I wanted to pick one fantasy book since I do read predominantly fantasy. And I wanted to pick one from a book that I've read before, just to see if that kind of either helps or hinders how well I'm paying attention to it. Whether my mind kind of wanders because I already know what's happening, or because I already know what's happening, I can follow along with it easier. I'm really curious about that. For my first book, I picked Sadie by Courtney Summers. This one I have heard so many things about. Almost every review that I've seen for this book has at least mentioned the audiobook, and I've heard a ton of great praise about the audiobook itself. So I decided this would be a really good book to try. The second book I'm going with is City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. I've actually never read the Mortal Instruments series. I just kind of missed the boat on it when I was younger, when it was first coming out, and I just haven't got back to it yet. And it's something that I've been meaning to read, so I thought this would be a great opportunity. And I thought it would be good for my fantasy book because there isn't a lot of really intense world building. Song of Ice and Fire, for example, I started reading those books and I found I had to keep flipping to the front to kind of reread and make sure I knew which characters were which. I'm currently reading the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, and there's like an appendix in the back that I've had to flip to a couple times because I kept getting like the magic system a little bit confused and had to just double check the notes. So I think something like that would be a little bit too difficult for an audiobook for me personally. So I thought this one would be a pretty fair chance. And the third book I'm going with is James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. I've mentioned it before, I'm a huge fan of his. I have a box set right there. And I thought I would go with one shorter book, so I thought this would be a great choice for it. I'm going to listen to the 3 audiobooks, take a comment, and then I'm going to come back. I'm going to do very quick reviews of the 3 books. I'm not going to get into any spoilers and how I thought that listening to it specifically affected the reading experience. So without further ado, let's get into it. And we're back. So honestly, that went better than I expected. So my initial pros and cons. Pros is definitely how much faster it is. Not necessarily faster. Basically, because I was listening to the book rather than physically reading it, I was able to multitask more. So whereas normally I would maybe only have an hour to read before I had to stop and say make supper and do the dishes, something like that, I was able to do that while listening to it, so I finished it faster than I would have even if the reading process wasn't as fast. I mean, I did finish all 3 books in 2 days, so that was really awesome. I definitely noticed that my attention was kind of drifting sometimes, and there was a lot of times that I'd have to go back because I either realized that I had no idea what we were talking about, or I kind of spaced out and then realized, oh, I should probably figure out who in the world is even talking, what's happening in this scene. So that was definitely a downside for me, and I'm sure that that's something that I would get better at with practice, but as of right now, I can't quite pay as close attention to it. So I'm going to go through the 3 books I read. Like I explained, I'm going to give a very quick review of them, focusing on the audiobook aspect itself, and let's just get right to it. So the first book I listened to was Sadie by Courtney Summers. I rated this like a 7.5 out of 10. I definitely do think that the audiobook format was great. I don't know how the podcast parts are written in the book, but personally, I don't like reading other types of media in my books. Aside from maybe like a short journal entry here or there, or sometimes there'll be a very, very brief like newspaper clipping, that I don't mind, but I don't know, for me it just really takes me out of it. So I definitely don't think I would have enjoyed physically reading this book as much as listening to the audiobook, and I can definitely see why it got so much praise. The story itself, it was okay, but I definitely didn't love it, and I think, to be fair, I had higher expectations going in because I've only heard great things about this story, and I was expecting to like it more, so I think that probably affected my rating a little bit. I was invested in the story, like I cared about the characters, and I was curious to see how the mystery got solved, but I just didn't feel satisfied. I felt the ending just kind of fell a little flat. One problem I had that is specifically because I listened to it in audiobook format is because it's a mystery, I like to go back and kind of re-look over some clues as I'm reading along for a mystery book. As I'm trying to go through and solve the mystery for myself, sometimes I'll flip back to kind of reread a section, look for certain clues. If there's a little detail that I can't quite remember, I'm going to look for exactly that detail. And I guess I technically could have done this with the audiobook. I could have just rewound it and then fast forwarded it, but that's a lot more difficult than, you know, putting a bookmark in and post-it notes and going from there. So I definitely think that audiobooks aren't a good format for me for mysteries. The second book I listened to was James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. This is the one that I have already read. I read this about 1,000,000 years ago when I was really little, and honestly, I don't think that the physical reading experience versus the audiobook experience was really much different for me. I think that's also because it's a children's book, so it's so much simpler, and even when I kind of noticed my attention wavering and kind of wasn't fully paying attention, I still didn't really miss anything. Every now and then I would have to go back like 10 seconds just to figure out who was talking, or someone would reply to something and I realized I didn't quite catch the question. But aside from that, I really don't think that the audiobook experience was very different from the physical book experience for me. I gave this book like an 8 out of 10. Most of that honestly is because nostalgia. I'm gonna have this big, thick, layered plot and these characters with these giant developments and all these different aspects to them because it is a children's book, but for a children's book, I think it's very well done. 8 out of 10. And finally, the third book I listened to was the first in the Mortal Instruments series, so City of Bone by Cassandra Clare. I would rate this a 7 out of 10. I want to say 6.5, but 6 just sounds so low. So I'm going to round up and say 7 out of 10, but I didn't like it. First of all, the audiobook format itself, I don't know, I wasn't a huge fan of the narrator. I'm glad I went with a simpler fantasy because I think if it would have been some large-scale kind of complicated fantasy world, I don't think I would have been able to listen to it in audiobook very well, but because this one is set in pretty much modern day and everything's pretty straightforward, it wasn't that bad. A couple times I couldn't quite catch the word they were saying. I'll look it up and I'll write it here, but they kept referring to them as a word and I just couldn't hear it. Because it's not a word that I know or recognize, I had a hard time understanding it, but that's a very small thing. But if this would have been a bigger, more complicated fantasy world, I think that definitely would have been a problem. Now, a quick review of the story itself. It's not for me. I feel like if I would have read this when I was younger, like as a teenager, I definitely would have enjoyed it more. But reading it as an adult, and also I read primarily adult novels, not YA, so it just seemed very young because I feel like this is a younger YA. Honestly, I didn't like any character. Like, I'm not saying I hated everybody or anything, but I don't know, there are no characters that I can say I was a fan of. I found the writing very young, and to be fair, Cassandra Clare has written a billion more books since then, so her writing style probably has grown up a little bit, but where this is the only experience I have with her, I wasn't really into it. I don't know, like I said, it's an older book, it's meant for a younger teenage audience, so I think that I'm just not this book's intended audience anymore. So my final thoughts on audiobooks. I learned that they're definitely not my preferred reading format for mystery, and I wouldn't like them in a bigger fantasy world. For less complicated novel, this is definitely something that with practice I think I could learn to enjoy, but I do still get distracted and I do have a harder time processing auditory information. So I think that if I had an audiobook and didn't have the physical book, I would have no problem reading the audiobook, but if I had to choose between the two, I definitely still think I would gravitate towards reading a physical book. But all that being said, I'm definitely glad that I gave them a serious try instead of just, saying, oh no, audiobooks aren't for me, and then just shrugging them off. So I'm glad that I did this experiment so I can say, what works and specifically what doesn't work for me, so I can just read better going forward and know more about myself and my reading tastes, and that's always good. So I guess that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any specific tips or tricks on how to enjoy audiobooks more, feel free to leave them in the comments because like I said, I'm not against trying audiobooks again in the future. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button so I know, and if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe. I make videos every Wednesday and Saturday, usually reading or writing related, and I keep forgetting to mention it, but I started using Twitter, so feel free to follow me on Twitter because I don't really have that many friends yet. So thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you guys next time, and until then, have a great day. Bye!